Welcome to Behind the Music, the Houston Chamber Choir's weekly podcast. I'm St. John Flynn. Joining me on this episode is the Houston Chamber Choir's official photographer, Jeff Grass. Jeff, welcome. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
So I said you are the choir's official photographer. How long have you held that position?
About 8 years, I think. But you know, the years kind of roll together, so I'm not exactly sure. But and it wasn't a clear beginning. I've probably the last 5 or 6 years I've photographed really everything the choir does. I do all of the concerts. I do the photography for the brochure, or the promotional materials at the beginning of the year. The headshots that are in the programs and on the website, special events. Before that, I did occasional things for the choir. I took some promotional photos. So I've been with the choir for a long time, but it kind of has developed into the relationship where I really feel an important part, because my images are used in so many different ways. And so I really appreciate that. It's a great relationship.
I understand that you came to start to do photography for the choir because you knew Bob Simpson through Christ Church Cathedral.
I'm a musician as well. And for much of my professional life, I was a musician only. I didn't do photography professionally. I had it as just an avocation. But about 25 years ago, I opened my photography studio. And when Bob came to town, I had already been playing occasionally at the cathedral, where he, at Christ Church Cathedral, where he came to be the organist and choir master originally. Mm-hmm. And so he got my name as a potential trumpet player, and I played a number of things for him. And at some point I found out that, well, actually, even before I knew about the chamber choir, I just, he had the choir at the church, and I said, if you ever need a photographer, I've opened a studio. And when I first started my photography business, I really felt like like a trumpet player who was also taking photos. And that's transitioned over the years to where now I pretty much introduce myself as a photographer and some people know I'm also a musician, and I've continued to perform. But years ago, I made my living from performing and teaching, and as a freelancer, it's always touch and go. How are you going to make your rent?
Feast and famine.
Yeah, I did okay playing gigs, but I also had students, and you really count on that income. I did, and. Mm-hmm. It's tough because as you teach, you count on the school schedule. When they're not, school's not in session, then the students aren't regular about their lessons, and if they've got contests, then they may not be available for lessons. And there's just lots of things that interfere, and mm-hmm. So when our older son was born, our first child, my wife was like, it would really be great if you had something else to bring in some income. Right, and right. I started looking around at things that I felt like I could do and that I could still, be always available to perform. Mm-hmm. And I tried a number of things and was just miserable, trying to make money outside of music. And I had a friend who I had a quintet. When I first moved to Houston in 1983, I got together with some guys that had an existing quintet, but the other trumpet player had just left town. And so we started playing together, and our first jobs were at the Texas Renaissance Festival. So we played every weekend that fall. And then when the festival was over, we decided, we really liked playing together and the group was good. We'd keep it together. And so it wasn't really the same group it had been. And so we changed the name, and it became Paragon Brass Ensemble in 1983. I had a buddy who was doing the promo photos for the quintet. Every time we had a new concert or a new season or something, he'd do a photo for us. And I had played with the Houston Ballet that first year when I got into town. They had a contractor that was using me a lot. Mm-hmm. And so I was playing with the ballet, and I had a friend who was also in the ballet, but who was working for a well-known photographer here in town, whose name was Heinz Kugler. And my friend was Steve Schmidt, and he took our photos. And I used to hang out after the photo shoot, and we just talk shop. And so, years later, when I was looking for some other way to make some money, he said, you really have a good understanding of photography. You could make some money doing some photography on the side. Mm-hmm. And I said, well, what would be involved? Because I had a 35 millimeter camera, but that I had no real professional equipment. And so we talked about it, and he kind of was my mentor as I got started in business.
You started, your interest in photography was a hobby to begin with. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, it was just, I guess a hobby. It was my brother, when I was a little kid, my older brother, when he was in high school, had been interested in photography. Mm-hmm. And so when I was in 8th grade, he had a dark room in the basement. And so I was exposed to it, I feel, pardon the pun, at an early age. And then later, when I was in college, my father really got into photography, and more, it definitely is a hobby, but more art photography. He wasn't taking pictures of, family gatherings. He was taking pictures of esoteric stuff, and so I was exposed to photography. And then my father died very young. And so when I was, I think 23 or 24, he died, and I inherited his camera. And so I started taking photos then more seriously, and not just a point and shoot, but trying to figure out the camera.
Right.
And then I traveled a lot. As a young musician, I played with the American Wind Symphony after graduate school. And while I was there, I got a job in Ecuador. And so, I took my camera with me and got, had lots of opportunities for photographs in Ecuador. And the orchestra there, I was played with the National Symphony. We did a tour down into the Amazon. And
oh, really?
Yeah, and into some of the villages down there. And so we, there were opportunities. I have a photograph that I remember from that tour of a priest blessing a Mack truck with holy water, because that was this truck had just been acquired by someone in the village, and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. And of course, colleagues I would photograph and such. And then,
so you were interested. It wasn't when I said hobby, you were actually more interested in the art of photography.
I was never, and until I had kids, and then I had reason to, just to take pictures of my little kids running around. But even then, I was more interested in getting them in the studio and getting a portrait than just, a photograph of them.
When you are photographing the choir, mm-hmm. what benefit, if any, is it that you're also a very accomplished musician?
I think there is a benefit. there's a practical benefit in that I recently got a new camera that can photograph entirely silently. But until a year ago, I didn't have that. And, so there was always some shutter sound, that click and the mirror dropping in the camera, which makes a little clunk. And so knowing, and being able to anticipate when I could take a photograph that wouldn't be heard by the audience. Watching, like if there's an instrumentalist with the choir, watching when they're going to make a sound so that I could, coordinate with it.
Right.
Or knowing the music that the choir's singing, knowing when it's going to get loud enough that I can take a photograph. And also, I always feel when I'm photographing people that my job is to make them look their best, whether that's a portrait or an action photo. I'm doing sports, it's helpful to know the sport, to know, or, dance. It's helpful to know what they're going to do so you can get them at full extension. So with singers, it's a challenge because you don't notice some of the expressions when you're just watching them sing because they're very fleeting. But that's what a photograph is it's a fleeting moment. And so it's very easy to catch a singer singing that's not very flattering. And so, and the chamber choir is full of lovely people who are actually also attractive people, but it's also possible to get them not looking their best, like, you don't want that. And so, that's not really a benefit of music, of knowing the music, but just of being very sensitive to that, you can't just take a photo at any moment. You have to, wait for certain sounds, vowel sounds. And some of the singers are just a joy to photograph because the expressions are so wonderful.
Right. What about when you photograph the choir for promotional material, and you get to pose them? What's that like?
Well, that's a lot of fun. And, now with the executive director that the choir has, Miriam Khalili, Miriam is actually also a photographer and an artist. Miriam is usually comes in with a vision. And so it's fun working together to make that work. Like last season with the smoke-filled room,
Yes.
She did a lot of the work on that to make that photograph. But she and I talk about, what her vision is. And so that's really good. She understands what I'm doing. And so we can discuss things. And she usually has a clear vision. So it's my job to help, make that happen. And that's a lot of fun.
Through photographing the choir over these last 7-8 years or so, what have you learned about your own photography, if anything?
I don't know. That's an interesting question. One thing I learned was I wanted a quieter camera because, there was always, with the chamber choir, it's not that many people. And although they can produce a very powerful sound, they also can produce an incredibly quiet, nuanced sound. So there were lots of times where I just couldn't take a photo.
Right.
And so that's why I got the new, just in case anyone's into cameras, the last few years, mirrorless cameras have really become popular and high enough quality. A mirrorless camera, well, a DSLR, which has a mirror in it so that you can actually see through the lens before you take the photograph. Because if it doesn't have a mirror, then you're not looking through the lens, you're looking through a viewfinder that I'm probably going to get
is it single lens reflex? Is that the SLR?
Single lens reflex.
Mm-hmm.
It has only one lens, and you look through the lens through the viewfinder. To do that, you have to have a mirror in the camera. Right. The new cameras that don't have that, the mirrorless cameras, it used to be you'd look through a viewfinder that was looking at your subject from a slightly different angle than the lens, and so you had parallax. And so that was always a concern. Those are called rangefinder cameras. Well, the new ones, they're actually a video camera. You're looking at through the lens, but you're looking at what is on the sensor. So you're actually looking at a video feed, and only recently have they been good enough that they're professional level cameras. The advantage is you don't have the mirror, so there's no sound to that, and you can turn off the shutter and use only an electronic shutter, and so there's no sound at all. And so now I can be in recording sessions and photograph, and I have lately. That's been wonderful because I can actually document the process without being part of it, without being heard at all.
Right.
Because it's 100% silent. It makes no sounds at all. So that's wonderful. But there's always the challenge of, even when I'm not making any sound, I still have to be careful about being seen and movement, because I don't want to be part of the show. Right. I don't want to be a distraction at all. And so that's always my goal, is to be there and not to be a factor at all, not to be noticed by the audience. And when I'm photographing a wedding or a business event, it's really the same way. I don't want it to be about the photography. I want them to have great photographs, right. But I want it to be, I want the event to go on as if I'm not there. And, when I used to do weddings a lot more than I do now, but I used to tell the bride that, I'm going to photograph everything, but I want it to be to flow as if I'm not there at all. I don't want it to be, right. It's not a photo shoot, sure. It's a concert, or it's a sacred event, or whatever. My goal is to always document it and have wonderful photographs of everything without it ever having to be stop. Let's do that again. Look this way,
Yeah. Well, let's talk about your previous life. How did you come to be a trumpet player?
My mother was a musician, and my father was a real music lover, but not a musician himself. So I think I was always interested in music. It was always around.
What did your mother play?
She played piano and organ. Before I knew her, when she was a teenager, she actually was an entertainer, and she played. She had an act where she played piano and Hammond organ together in a nightclub.
Oh, wow.
And so she would, lots of the nights she'd be there by herself. And then like on the Friday and Saturday, other musicians would come in and she'd accompany them. But then, when I knew her, she was mostly a church musician. She was an organist in a church and a pianist, and was always my accompanist, and the band directors were always really happy when I was in band, because they got an accompanist along in the deal. And so, she'd play for everybody at solo and ensemble contest. Before I started playing, I always thought that I would play drums. I guess, maybe that's all little kids like drums. But when I was in 5th grade, they brought high school students in, and they played their instruments, all the band instruments for us, and we got to hear them and pick what we were going to play. And so I went home that day and said, I'm going to play trumpet. And I did, So my parents were very supportive, and they rented a cornet, I started in cornet, not trumpet, but it's essentially the same. It's the plays the same notes, has the same fingerings. It's just a slightly different sound. So I played, and that was we lived in Oklahoma at the time. My father was a teacher, university professor, and he was at Oklahoma State. And so I started playing trumpet in Oklahoma. And then we were there for 6th and 7th grade. And then we moved in 8th grade. He went to the Western Illinois University. And so I grew up mostly in Illinois from middle school until, which there was no middle school when it was junior high school.
Junior high.
And then,
but you continued to play through junior high.
Yeah, junior high, high school, in college.
Into college, right?
And actually, when I was in high school, as a senior in high school, I was thinking of going 3 directions. I was considering going into journalism. I had a good journalism teacher, and was on the newspaper staff. I was the assistant editor of the newspaper in high school. And my father never pushed foreign languages and never taught us any himself, but that's what he did, and was always encouraging. So I took Spanish throughout high school, and I thought about going into Spanish. And then I loved music and always did well, and so I thought about studying music. And really, I think the deciding factor was I was in Spanish class as a senior, and the teacher was going around and asking everyone, what their plans were for next year. Are you going to college? Are you going to get a job? What are you going to do? And he asked, and as everyone went around, he listened, and when he got to me, he said, "Oh, I assume you're going into music." And so, I was kind of taken aback, actually, because I thought, maybe he was going to encourage me to study Spanish, but he was like, I assume you're going into music. And I think, that was kind of a turning point where I thought, well, yeah, I think maybe I should. And I did. And it was definitely supported by my parents. My dad, as I said, was a music lover. I think he was a frustrated artist. He was really a Renaissance man. He was very, very learned, very erudite, was a very, distinguished scholar, but I think he always had wanted to be a musician. Okay. I actually have a photograph of him as a little kid, as a scout, playing bugle. And it was evidently not a good bugler, but and they're just, my mother was a musician, and he was very supportive of that, and always read about music and was an avid listener. And right. My parents attended every concert put on at the university, and they came to every concert I ever gave, and so very supportive.
So growing up, what was the music that you heard at home?
It was a mix. Actually, about the concert that the choir did with Dave Brubeck, and that was, all of his albums were things that I heard as a child. Take Five, I remember hearing when I must have been in grade school. My parents had. They had Miles Davis, Errol Garner. Music that I came to love. Right. They were big fans of Louis Armstrong, who, funny, when I was a little kid, I didn't appreciate. I thought, I didn't think he was a great trumpet player, but I've changed my opinion. But then a lot of classical music, all the well-known composers. I remember as a young high schooler, my parents got a recording of Mahler's First that I used to geek out with my brass friends. We, play the, of course we weren't listening to all the boring string parts. We were just listening to where it got loud, the brass parts. But, so yeah, obviously Beethoven, Mahler, Brahms.
Well, you brought up Dave Brubeck, and he performed in Houston with the Houston Chamber Choir. Your ensemble, the Paragon Brass, were part of that concert as well.
Right. Yeah. Interestingly, he had some pieces, and I'm not sure what the provenance of those were, but he came with his trio. So it was a jazz trio, and then the choir, and they did a number of pieces together. But then there were a couple that was the jazz trio, choir, and brass quintet. Luckily. So yeah, we got to play on those, and that was a real thrill getting to play with him.
What was he like to play with?
Oh, he was a joy. He was, he was old then, and was very, energetic and just wonderful and very gracious. He was up for, all the photos with people afterward, and signing people would bring old recordings, the old vinyl discs, and he signed the covers and all that. It was really a lot of fun.
Talk about Paragon Brass. You said it's a brass quintet. So what's the instrumentation?
Well, it's pretty much the standard, which is 2 trumpets, French horn, trombone, and tuba. There are some quintets that, very, very rarely they'll have 3 trombones and 2 trumpets, or 2 trombones instead and no tuba. But ours is actually the really well-known group like ours is the Canadian Brass, and they really first hit the scene when I was in college, and so there was no way you're not going to have that instrumentation, because they published some of their arrangements, and so it was great to be able to play it with that instrumentation. But when I was in high school, I played a couple of brass quintets and loved it, just loved doing that. Probably more than any other medium at that time. I just loved doing it. So I did it whenever I could. And then when I went to college, I had a quintet.
Because you went to the University of Illinois for your undergraduate, and then you went on to do a graduate degree at the University of Nebraska, was it?
Yeah, Nebraska-Lincoln. And I was I got the teaching assistantship there. So I was teaching brass methods and trumpet lessons and working my master's. After that, I went on a tour of Porgy and Bess in Europe, which we did for a year. And I had my quintet library, and we'd, from the orchestra, we had a quintet, and we'd go out and play in the plaza in Frankfurt or Cologne or, Bordeaux or wherever we were, just for fun and to make.
What was it like? Money. What was it like being a touring musician?
I loved it. It's, some people just don't like living out of a suitcase, but I didn't have a problem with that. And it was a wonderful life. We were young, and that's where I met my wife. Actually, she was the stage manager for the tour.
Oh, really?
And, so the first day of the tour, she'd been there for a couple of weeks with the set, but it was called the New York Harlem Opera Ensemble, but it was really just put together for the tour.
Right.
I don't think the New York Harlem Opera Ensemble existed except for Porgy and Bess for this tour. And the first day I was in Arnhem, Holland, I was in the pit and she was on stage, and she had to, assign people hotel rooms, and so I'm in the pit and looking up at this stage and struck by this beautiful young woman, and so we started dating on the tour, and then that went for, I think it was 9 months was the tour, and so she actually left the tour slightly before the end because it was extended at the end, and she had enough. And
she'd had enough of the tour, not of you.
Yeah, evidently,
right.
Because we did continue, but so she went back to home, which was Ohio, and when the tour was extended another month into Spain, actually it was extended because of Mundial, the World Cup. We were the cultural representative for World Cup that year. And so that was interesting, playing in all the cities where the World Cup matches were. But then when the tour ended and I came back to the States, I went first to see her, and then I went home to Illinois.
You then went to play with the Mexico City Philharmonic.
Right. Actually, I went to see Patty in Ohio, and then we went to Chicago together and met a friend of mine who from college, who was a Chicagoan, but just happened to be back. This was summertime, and he was back at home on vacation, and he was playing in the orchestra in Mexico City. And he said, "Hey, we have an opening for second trumpet in the orchestra." He was playing third assistant first, and I said, "Yeah, I'm interested." So my audition for the orchestra, this is not the way it normally works, but for this job, it worked. My audition was, we drove down, and my first week on the job was my audition.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Then they decided whether they, were going to offer me the job, and they did, luckily, because we had moved there. Yeah, and then I was in Mexico for a year. And then at the end of that year, Patty...
she came with you to Mexico?
Yeah, she came with me to Mexico.
Yeah.
And taught at the American school. I said, what are you going to do? And she said, well, I'll do something. I'll find something. And so she taught at the American school for a year, and then decided that she wanted to come back and get a master's degree. And so she got a fellowship at the University of Houston. And so that's how we ended up here.
Oh, really? So what does she do?
Well, she was the stage manager and got a fellowship in the theater department. And after a short time decided that that's really not what she wanted to do the rest of her life. And so she transferred into the psychology department and got a degree, and she's a psychotherapist. And
so she, much like you, made a large change. So in many ways, you've got the best of both worlds, because you've got the photography business, but you also continue playing, and Paragon Brass is still very much alive and kicking.
Right. Yeah. We're less busy as a quintet. I think I'm the only guy in the quintet that does something outside of music, but they all teach and have other jobs. A couple of them play in the ballet or the opera, and our tuba player now plays in the symphony in symphony orchestra in Austin. So it's really a good group, and really fine musicians, and only can stay together because they have enough work in the broad spectrum. It's not just the quintet.
Right.
Yeah.
So in terms of being at every Houston Chamber Choir concert in the time that you have been the photographer, do you have favorite pieces that they have performed? That's perhaps an unfair question, but
well,
anything that stands out?
There are some pieces that they've performed that stand out that I just loved. and I couldn't tell you the names, the titles.
Right.
When I talk to one of them, I'll say, the one that does this, but there are just some incredible pieces that they play, that they've performed that I love. But what I found, it's funny. When I was in high school, my parents would take me to choral concerts because my parents loved choral music, and I was just not a fan. If it wasn't loud brass, I was just not that interested. But my musical tastes were refined, and I've matured, and I find whatever the choir does, I just love it. And of course it helps that I know the people now, the personalities, but it's just a joy to work with the choir because anything they do is at such a high level. Bob has such a high standard. The quality is great, and beyond that, the people are great. So it's just a joy to work with the choir. And since I am at everything, I've gotten to know people, at a somewhat more personal level than just as an audience member.
Right.
And and that's something that other people can do too, because the choir has lots of opportunities for the audience to get involved, as a supporter beyond just sitting in the audience.
Well, Jeff, thank you very much for sharing your story with us and letting us know that you have this secret life as a trumpet player. But thank you for making the choir look so good. And we appreciate all that you do for the choir and being part of this wonderful musical family.
It really is a wonderful musical family, and it's just a joy to be part of it. When the choir was supposed to go to New Zealand this past summer, and which didn't happen because of the coronavirus, I was really lobbying to get to go. And I'm not sure I was in the budget, but I feel like I do contribute, but definitely I want to be included because it's a joy for me. So it's a great relationship.
Well, you're a big part of the family. Thank you very much. And thank you to everybody who supports the Houston Chamber Choir. As a supporter, as a patron, as a viewer or a listener, we appreciate it. I'm St. John Flynn, and this is Behind the Music. Join us again next time.
The Houston Chamber Choirs with One Accord is your one-stop shop for choral joy. If you enjoyed this podcast, help us to continue our mission to grow the esteem and appreciation of choral music by sharing, reviewing, and subscribing to our content. As a 501c3 nonprofit, support from listeners like you allows us to continue making new and exciting programming. For more information about us and how you can support our work, please visit HoustonChamberChoir.org/give.